Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to the Family Ministry Podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and this is episode 68. In today's episode, I interview Rich Birch of unSeminary.com. And Rich and I talk all about what does it take to break 1,000 in attendance as a church. And your church may be 300, your church may be 3,000, but still, this is going to be important to you because he talks about a lot of the barriers that churches face, really regardless of size, but they really show up at that 1,000 barrier. I happen to believe that some of these barriers show up again and again. They just look different because the size of the church is different. You know, a church that's small, maybe 100 people, 200 people. One of the biggest barriers is they have usually one staff person, maybe two, and everybody wants to know everybody. Everybody wants to know the staff and be really connected to them, and that's a barrier for the church. A lot of times they have one service. You know, that can be a barrier for the church. Well, the same thing can happen as you approach 1,000. Now you have multiple staff, but you probably have one staff for each area, and yet every area feels like it could use more than that. So I happen to think a lot of church growth barriers are related to staff, either being overstaffed or understaffed or not having the right structure, all that. And Rich talks about some of that. So I think whatever size church you serve in, this will be helpful to you. Now, before we jump into the interview with Rich, I just want to remind you that right now, if you're listening to this when it came out or a week or so later, we have Mastermind Groups that are going to launch this fall for children's ministry leaders, youth ministry leaders, next-gen pastors, those of you who serve in a multi-site context. We got a lot of groups that are launching. Myself, Kevin Monahan, Kenny Conley, and Will Hutcherson will be leading those. And sign-ups are ongoing right now, but they're over half full. So the deadline's not till September 15th. However, if the groups fill up, then they fill up. You know, that looks like it could very well happen before the deadline. So in general, they're half full. Some groups are a little less than half full. Some are a little more than half full. So if you're thinking about that, I'd encourage you to sign up now. Don't wait. You want to sign up and make sure you get a spot in a group. The other thing is the volunteer playbook group. I'm looking for 20 people who want to recruit more volunteers and are willing to dedicate 10 weeks, a few hours a week at least, to band together. And we'll kind of walk through a process. I'll teach each week something to help us all build our volunteer system from the ground up, or maybe rebuild it, you know, depending on where you are. Well, that group already has 15 slots taken, so there are only 5 spots left. So if you're interested in that, be sure to jump on that. Once it does fill up, though, if you are in a mastermind group, you get that for free, and there's no limit there. So, you know, everybody in a mastermind group could participate in that if they want. So just want to remind you about that. If you're interested in either of those, if you have any questions, please email me, nick@nickblevins.com. But go ahead and sign up now if you're interested before those spots run out. Let's go ahead now and jump into my interview with Rich about the difference between churches, you know, under 1,000 and over 1,000 and how they get there. Today I'm joined by Rich Birch. Welcome to the podcast, Rich.
Oh, Nick, I am so glad to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump in here.
Well, first, before I tell you anything about me, one of the things I've said time and time again is the most creative, energetic, best leaders in the church are family ministry people. So I am I just feel honored to be here. Now, that might be called pandering to the audience, but
it's okay. We'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's literally true. Like I started in student ministry, and I've been kind of in executive pastor roles for the last, I guess it's been almost 20 years, in a couple different churches. I'm from Canada. I'm originally, was born and raised there. So I was at a church in the Toronto area called the Meeting House, which we were an early kind of leader in the multi-site movement. This is now we're going, that was 17, 18 years ago, and led that church through expansion, through one location all the way up to six or seven. When I stepped out, and actually was with Kerry Newhoff 10 years ago, when he launched out, if you know any of his story, a little bit about how they launched out into multi-site. And then for the last 7, almost 8 years, I was in New Jersey at a church called Liquid Church, which that church is in the Manhattan-facing suburbs of New Jersey. And same kind of thing, like some similar pattern, really, a church led from one location to 5. They, grew to 3,500, 4,000 people, somewhere in that range. Started around 800 or so when I started there. I also blog on the side and have a podcast called unSeminary. So, but I'm just glad to be here, glad to be with you. Like I say, I find there's something about family ministry people. They just are some of the brightest lights in the church. So I'm happy to be here today.
Well, we appreciate that. The fact that you started out in student ministry probably means, you can never lose that, which is actually a good thing, I think. Some of the best, it seems like if you dig in, some of the best churches that made changes to reach people, I think of like North Point and Andy Stanley,
Totally.
Like they started in student ministry and in student ministry, it's like you need to connect with students in a different way. Otherwise it doesn't work at all, so
Absolutely.
then you just translate that to the overall church and wow, you have something that seems to connect better, which is cool. So
it seems like so many effective churches are just the last generation student ministry, but better funded.
Yes, exactly.
It's like we're doing the same thing that they were doing in student ministry 15 years ago. They just have real money now. So it's just kind of fun.
That was our church totally too. Our pastor was a student pastor for 13 years, led a very successful student ministry. And you could just, even the way our services were programmed, I wasn't with him at the other church, but when I hear stories, it's like, oh, that's basically exactly what you did in student ministry.
Right.
Just made sure the game was a little bit more fun for adults or whatever it might be,
right.
Which is interesting. Right. Kind of makes me wonder though, what the next version would look like. What does student ministry look like now that's so different? Or is it? I don't know. You know what I mean? In churches that would look different as a church 10 years from now. I'm not sure. So
yeah, I think we're all looking for that, right? We're all trying to figure out what is, where's this headed next and how do we keep reaching the next generation for sure.
One challenge that churches have, not many, obviously, because many churches don't get here, but in reaching people is growth barriers. And we were just talking before we recorded about how there's a lot of information out there about breaking maybe the 200 or 250 barrier in a church, and for good reason, because that's where most churches are. But we're going to talk a lot about the 1,000 barrier, something you have a lot of experience with. And obviously, if somebody's listening, their church is 5,000 or 500 or whatever, there'll be principles they can take away. But for a church overall that is somewhere in there, and I imagine that could be 700 to 1,200, really.
Yes. Range.
What are some of the challenges you see they face to really grow past 1,000 and not get stuck there?
Yeah, it does seem like only 2% of all churches will break the 1,000 barrier. So it is very small, percentage of overall churches that will ever go over that. And there seems to be a lot of this barrier I've been thinking more and more about, I'd say in the last year or so, as I reflect on my own story. Both the Meeting House and Liquid, I started at both of those churches when we were in that kind of 800, 900 range, and kind of saw them through that and to, somewhere up to about 4,000. And I've noticed over the years as I've talked and coached with churches that a lot of times they're in that range. And it seems what happens is churches, they grow up under, usually there's one or two things that when you talk with everyone in the church, you say, what is it about this church that brings people here? Why is it that people come to this church? A lot of times churches that are, have slowed down somewhere around 1,000 in their growth. They can clearly identify those one or two things, but really there are a few other areas of the church that are atrophied, firing on the same cylinders. Some of that could be staff, could be kind of the church has grown up, or certain ministry areas have grown up with the same people through that time. And it's a little bit of what got us here won't get us there. Some of it could be mindset. A lot of times you end up running into key leaders who, although they may say that they believe that God wants their church to reach more people, or they kind of give, mental assent to that, they can't get their head around what it looks like to lead at that level. And, they may hold on to old habits that really, keep their church from expanding and reaching new people, or they try to keep their hand on too many things. A lot of times you'll find a church at that level, there's a bunch, you'll find churches at that level. There's also a structural or governance issue, how decisions are done. That typically, I was literally just yesterday talking to a church of 800 people that they've grown and they feel like they're a bit stuck. And when you started listening to them and hearing them out, a part of it was they're holding on to an older decision making model that worked when they were a church of 200 people. They stretched it to 800, but the advice I was giving them was I think you're really going to have to stare into that and figure out how to modify that to just have a bit more of a lean decision making model. And specifically within family ministry, to kind of bring it back to what we're talking about today, I've noticed a lot of churches say a church is under 1,000, there is kind of mental assent by the leadership around, like kids ministry, student ministry, that's like important, like we should do that. But then when you talk to churches that are, say, 5,000, 10,000, that are at those next couple plateau marks, there's absolute clarity that kids and family are critical growth engines for the church. And so I think there's something that happens. One of the things that needs to take place at this barrier is actually a refocusing on the importance of, and, the funding of, and the leadership of, children and student ministries, so that they become, really growth engines that ultimately help reach the church. So actually, a bit of, I think from my seat, one of the things I've run into and seen multiple times is actually, family ministry can be a barrier if we're not focusing intentionally on it. And it's not that churches below 1,000 don't intentionally focus on it, but churches that are, if they're stuck at 1,000, one of the questions I would drill into is what's actually happening in your children's ministry, in your family ministry, in your, in your, student ministry, to ensure that, it's well led, well funded. There's a good strategy built around that. It's building towards the future. It's a leadership magnet, not a leadership deterrent. All those bits and pieces.
What would you say? Would you be able to maybe compare, a church that's, at the barrier but can't get past it, and family ministry is a barrier, versus, a church that's past it and they're using it now as an engine for growth? What are some of the specific maybe differences in what they look like and how they work? Because even like you said, funded, I think people wonder, obviously there's no way to get specific budget wise, but people wonder, like, is that my church? Are we underfunded? Are we not? Are we a barrier in family ministry? Are there some things you could say they're like, this is what it looks like when it's not, when it is a barrier, this is what it looks like when it's actually an engine?
Okay, so, when you think about overall church growth, a lot of times they talk about, at the 200 barrier, they talk about the fact that, the leaders have to get past the 200 church size, the leaders themselves have to restructure their relationships so that all roads don't lead to them. So it can't be, the pastor, you're not going to be able to get to beyond 200 people if, like, the pastor or the leaders of the church are like, they're always the ones that are showing up, at the hospital, or they're the ones that, like, all relationships are brokered through them. You just can't do that. Now, interesting thing that happens, I think, in the student and family ministry, kids ministry, is when you get to the size of about 1,000 overall attendance, a lot of churches, when you combine what's happening in, say, birth through 18 or 20, birth through college, let's say cradle to college, a lot of times the size of that ministry is pushing somewhere up against that 200 number. It's pushing up against a very similar kind of barrier. Now, I think a lot of times on the leadership side, the key leaders who are leading these ministries, when the ministry is a bit smaller, they'll have a similar mindset to the leaders of a church leading, say, 150 people. They kind of once I was talking with a ministry leader, and he said, the problem with most kids ministry pastors. I said, no. I said, what's the problem? They said, the problem with most kids ministry pastors is they like kids too much.
Yeah.
And I think we've all bumped into those characters. I'm sure there's none of them on that listen to the show, but you bumped into those people who they just love spending time with kids. They're drawn towards kids, but actually to grow your family ministry beyond, to help your church really catapult over the 1,000 barrier, you have to see yourself more as, and have to be more interested in, a person that's replicating systems of care rather than being kind of all roads come to that person. And so, a lot of times, what does that look like? So for leaders, I think it's less about at this stage, it's less about the kind of participants in the ministry and more about structuring towards the leaders, which, and how are we, building them up? What are we doing to ensure that, every kid that arrives, they don't need me, Mr. Billy, to say hi to everybody as they come in, which again is probably a model that works in a smaller church, as opposed to ensuring that every kid that arrives every Sunday morning is being cared for by an adult that they see on a regular, or a leader on a regular basis that they see. Does that make sense? So I think a part of it is the leader's own ability to replicate themselves through systems rather than seeing themselves as the primary delivery agent. There's a bunch more we can talk about, but that's a good place to start.
It totally makes sense to me. I've wondered, I heard somebody recently, Todd Wilson, I don't know if you know who Todd is, but he was talking about we have a church planting network in the area, and he was kind of the one speaking at one of our gatherings. And he was talking about how in some ways he feels like most church barriers are staff related. That's why, we were talking about 250, but a lot of churches never get past 100. And he was saying how, it makes sense that one person could lead 100 people, fairly well and be connected to them and all of that. And so that becomes a barrier. And we faced growing, and as our church grew as a church plant, and then I felt like we had a little bit of a barrier in that like 600 range where it was small staff, and it was kind of like you were talking about, where everybody kind of led their area. We all led volunteers, but we didn't necessarily have like another level of volunteers leading, like coaches or whatever. And it wasn't until we moved to a leadership team structure on staff, and some areas, though not many, as we got a little bit larger, got a little more than one staff person. And I could see where 1,000 is almost like the same problem, but now it's not at the pastor level. It's at the ministry leader level, because I guess once the church gets to 1,000 or certainly past it, you can start to add multiple staff to areas, right? And a lot of times you think of children's or student ministry as a small church. Like if you're a church of 1,000, you might have 200 and some kids. And that makes sense. You're saying that itself is a small church. So then it needs to be led, right? Like, not through that one leader, but
absolutely. And you'll start to see staff at a church of that size. You'll go from and this is this is going to be your area of expertise, but a lot of times they'll have the elementary pastor, and then the middle school pastor, and the high school pastor, and then maybe a college and career pastor. Maybe by the 1,000, you might not have all four of those, but you'll have some combo of those. But somewhere around there, you need to start within your staff structure asking this similar questions that you've done overall. Instead of just running these people all parallel with each other, instead of just saying your job is to care for all these people, what if you started asking questions around, well, how are we ensuring that there is a common connection pathway for kids or for students and young people across our entire family ministry? And so you may end up saying, as a ministry, instead of saying we're gonna go from having a middle school and high school pastor, so let's go to like a junior, like a freshman junior pastor, or a freshman sophomore pastor, and then a junior senior pastor, which some people do. They kind of eventually, they just keep getting more and more of the same. They could say, what if instead of doing that, we hired someone who their job was to help us with connections across our entire ministry? So they're gonna worry about and obsess on that first experience, the first touch experience across all our age brackets. What does that look like when someone first comes? And what about, how do we ensure that kids are landing into small groups that are, that are effective for them, and they have like real positive relationships in those, rather than just saying we're going to replicate kind of the same age model? What if we said we need to, and what that ultimately is trying to do is drive more specialization in leadership instead of generalization, right? Like if you're a high school pastor, you're kind of the jack of all trades, right? You do everything, as opposed to saying, no, like we need to begin to specialize. And you see that, again, if you look a couple stages down at a church of say 5,000, by the time you get to that point, within family ministry, you have people that literally all they do is worry about curriculum, right? They wake up Monday morning and they're trying to make all that work, and they may not have any interaction with kids at all. They're just trying to wrestle those issues to the ground. And then you'll typically have, maybe some communication people, maybe even graphic design, all that sort of thing. This is that time when a church needs to start pivoting in towards that, where you start saying, okay, we have to begin to specialize our staff, and ultimately to try to fill out a number of these areas that aren't, that are maybe we're rotating around just a couple key staff.
And this obviously all relates to staff in some ways being a barrier. Yep. And I wonder, this question, I guess, is probably more general, but certainly relates to family ministry. How often have you seen like space and the physical space, whether it's number of locations or number of services? How often have you seen that need to change drastically for a church to get past 1,000? Because a lot of times when I hear a history of a church that grows past 1,000, there was some move in there, building a building, moving to a new location. And sometimes it just happened to correlate with that barrier. And that was one of the things that helped them blow past it. Obviously it's not the magic button, because you could totally do that and not grow at all. But how big is that factor in this barrier, you think?
Oh, it's absolutely a factor. For sure, when you talk at a kind of a macro level outside of just family ministry, I think the pivot there, or the thing to think through facility wise, is up into 1,000. A lot of times churches are, frankly, and this may be a little too blunt for some people that are listening, but you're kind of just happy to be in whatever building you have. It's like we started renting we started renting the middle school, and then because that's what we could afford when we were church plant, and then we grew and we moved from the middle school to high school because they had a bigger auditorium, and we were just really happy about it. Well, somewhere in the 800, 900, 1,000 people, frankly, what happens is the financial model gets to the point where there is more finances in the mix, and it's probably the first time you can ask, rather than just whatever location we're in works, you can actually begin to ask strategic facility questions and say, if we could actually dream a little bit and actually build or get into the kind of, it doesn't necessarily need to be built, but get into the kind of facility we need to get into, what would that look like? And so, yes, absolutely. You'll see, there, and we all know those stories of the, like, if you build it, they will come. That it's not this kind of magic bullet, for jumping the 1,000 barrier, but it's a key piece of it, because typically what happens is, most church buildings or original, church, when you're a church planner, you're not getting a facility big enough to house this number of people. Even if you did 3 or 4 services, you're typically not in that. And it's usually around here that you're beginning to ask that question. And absolutely, facility is important. This again may sound too crass, but church is a retail business, right? Where we do what we do matters. Obviously, ultimately, the relationships with people is the ultimate. That's what it's all about. It's about getting people connected to each other and connected to God. But the physical location matters. And if you don't have, and people will debate, right? Is it full at 70% or 80%, but somewhere in there, or 110%? I know guys that think like it's not really full until you're over full.
People are standing.
At some point, you come to the point where it's just full, and people, because what happens is it disincentivizes people to invite their friends, because they're concerned if I don't invite. If I invite my friend and there's no place for them to sit, or worse, and more specifically even to family ministry, a lot of times it's not main auditorium, where you're seeing the pressure on attendance. It's usually, or a lot of times you'll end up seeing it's in like preschool space or parking or, elementary space. If a preschool mom shows up and they go into a room and there's 50 kids all crammed in there, the chance of her coming back is low, right? It feels, you've got to design that space well and ensure that it gives off the kind of, impression that you're hoping to give off, as the church grows.
I think it's pretty common, like what you said about the preschool mom coming. It seems really common when I talk to other church leaders that preschool or elementary seem to be the areas that fill up the fastest. And usually that's because when they're built, they're not built to the same scale. For whatever reason, things are trimmed. And our church is that way now, that you could fit far more in our auditorium than you could actually keep, in preschool, just running the ratios, and doing the math. And it's weird to think that could actually stunt the growth of your church. I mean, you're really getting down to like these rooms in this building, that only a percentage of the church uses, could be holding back the whole church in terms of growth. But you're saying, yes, that could actually be happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this goes out, maybe if you could pass on this portion to your executive pastor. I've been through a couple building campaigns, and when we built new buildings, had the privilege, the honor of doing that. And you absolutely have got to have the family ministry people at the table and those decisions, because what can happen is, well, I know exactly what happens. You sit around the table and what happens is, in an executive pastor's mind, they're thinking total number of attendees to revenue. And so what they're thinking is, let's get as many seats in the main auditorium as possible, because in their brain, they're thinking, if I take this times it by 2, then that means we can max out at blah, blah, blah. And they do some backwards math and figure out, how, because they're trying to face down how we're going to pay for all this. And so what that does is it puts pressure on the main auditorium to be as large as possible. And it can ultimately rob square footage from these other areas where a church would be wiser to sit down and wrestle through and study what other churches have done around, square footage ratios on, kids space to adult, to adult seating and all that, and figure out what does that look like. And, my encouragement, what we've done, and my encouragement has been be more generous on the younger end. So give more square footage towards elementary and preschool space, because those areas, they typically are a bit more specialized in their building, and they're harder to come back and fix down the road. But you also just need them. And what that does is it kind of reduces the total number of seats in the main auditorium. But ultimately what you want to do is grow the whole thing. And this is a bit of that, why over 1,000, eventually what happens is churches, again, if you see a church of 5,000 or 10,000, they're clearly understand that they are in the family business, for lack of a better word. They're trying to attract families to come to their ministry. And so there's no lack of understanding around, the importance of what happens in those spaces. There can be times in a church of 800 where frankly the senior leaders have been so focused on trying to get the main service out the door that they're just happy that something else is happening, and they believe and trust in the leaders, and they feel like, yeah, those are real competent people, and so we're happy to let them do what they do. But what has to shift over time is an understanding of the importance of that area, and we've got to invest in it to make it happen, both square footage and financially and leadership and all that.
How did you, because I know right and now you're preaching to the choir, and people, children's people are listening thinking, and student people were like, I don't even have a dedicated space. Like, how do I, you went through this at a couple different churches. How did you end up creating or coming to an agreement about what was needed? Did you use certain numbers as a guide? Did you you tried it a certain way and realized, we need more, and use that as a guide next time? Because I feel like that's part of the problem, is that it can be ambiguous. You know what I mean? The preschool or children's ministry person might be saying, I need this much space. The executive pastor saying, well, we don't have that, that needs to be lobby or whatever. How did you all make it work?
Yeah, so we did, this was probably close to 15 years ago. It was probably one of the best investments I made was, so it was myself, and we were building a building. It's a big building, 100,000 square feet. There was a lot of space to think through. And so when we were in the design phase, there was a very small group of us who literally got on a plane and flew every day we flew to a different city, so just across the country, and visited a bunch of churches. Because the problem with when you just look at designs on a page is it's hard to picture what does that look like, and how does that feel? What is that space? And what that really was the culmination of a research project where we spent, and it doesn't need to be laborious, but actually call up guys like Nick and say, Nick, who are 5 churches that you think do a killer job in have a great kids ministry space, family ministry space? Who are they, and can you put me in touch with their leaders? And you call them up and say, hey, can I get an hour of your time? I'd love for you to talk me through your kind of square footage to, kid ratios, and how many, what does that look like? And then in comparison, how does that lean up against both kind of the crush space or the foyer space around the facility? And then how does that lean against, ultimately the seats in the auditorium? And eventually what'll happen is when you do that research, you'll begin to see, some common numbers that follow out. But then you'll get a sense of like, I think we want to be a bit more than that. We want to, we want to be a little bit less. We feel like there may be over the top. So the space allocation phase, a lot of times, and I've seen in the past where folks that are in particularly kids ministry, they get really excited about like what's on the walls or like what the color is and what, those kinds of decisions. Or so they'll go to, insert brand name church, and they're like excited about what's on the walls. But actually, the bigger issue is space allocation, like how much space is given to them, and so rather than giving you a specific number, I think if you're really pursuing a project like that, you need to do the research and find some churches that work really well on that front, that kind of fit your style of ministry. You have to think through how they program. A lot of our churches, we do some version of a large group time and a small group time. How do those spaces interact with each other? Are we basically doubling up all our space because we need to have 2 spaces for them to go in? You need to think through all those decisions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the fact that you all went, you said there was a group of you, and if you went, you were not the children's person. So, I mean, that helps too, that somebody in leadership was also looking at these other churches with you. Yeah, and did you like look at the church overall? It wasn't just about family ministry. You probably went just to learn about their building, overall,
absolutely.
not just the family ministry. Yeah. And that probably does help.
Yeah, and we did this with the most recent one I was a part of. We had to, on the front end, in that early design phase, when we all were doing drawing lines on a paper, the thing I kept saying to our team through that phase is, listen, it's very cheap to change this now. Like it's very easy for us to like move a wall here, move a wall there when it's on paper. It becomes exponentially more expensive down the road. So you kind of have to force people to, and you have to figure out, some people are I'll give you an example. We did one building and this is like something I learned from a failure. We did a building and it was a renovation, pretty significant renovation of this one space. And the way, we had spent a lot of time poring over the drawings and how there was a lot of conversation, particularly with our family ministry team, around the entrance into elementary and how that worked. And, we stared at it a lot and I was clear how it was going to go. The architect was clear. We all talked about it. Everybody was together. Well, we built this thing and literally the day the walls went up, I'm standing there with our kids ministry person. And she was like, oh, I didn't know it would be like this. This isn't what I pictured at all. And what I realized was she was having a hard time translating lines on a page to reality. What does that actually look like? And so whoever's leading the project, you've got to take more time. And so I got into doing more like, let's just get some cheap 3D drawings done and like do what, or like tape stuff out on a floor, find a warehouse and tape stuff out on a floor and like, okay, let's go stand in what a kid's room is actually the size of it. So that you can, get a sense. And well, what if we actually got, I know we don't actually have 8 kids we can put in this room right now, but what if we got 8 staff or some volunteers to stand in here? How does it feel now? And what does it look like? And you've got to do, because of that initial phase up front when is where you need to kind of wrestle out all of those issues, and not just gloss over, because what happens is the closer you get to opening day, just the more and more expensive it becomes to make any change. And some of it, some decisions, they become irreparable. It's like, we're not going to rip this out. It's just because once you get up and running, you're not, you could say we're going to take 6 weeks off and not do this, but that's not typically what ends up happening.
Sure. So before we jump on to another good question, especially with your experience about working with family ministry leaders and all that, is there anything else you would say that churches need to think about related to family ministry and breaking the 1,000 barrier, changes they need to make, things that might be holding them back?
Yeah, I think, as a family ministry leader, you might be, as you're looking at your own church and you say like, hey, we're maybe a bit stuck here. And, I think the question you've got to ask yourself is, how am I multiplying what I'm doing? What am I doing in my area to multiply leadership? How am I multiplying myself, multiplying my leaders, encouraging my leaders to multiply? What should we be doing around multiple services? Should we be thinking about multi-site? Like what the idea of, multiplying out literally everything around us, is critical at this phase. It's rather than saying it's not a time to say we're going to try to consolidate everything under, 1 or 2 leaders. It's about how do we multiply? How do we do more of what we're doing? And which I think for some leaders, if I'm honest, I think that's like really hard for them. And there's like it's almost like a small death in it, because it's like, oh, like I used to be more involved in doing the active ministry. It might be like, you might have a person that's like really good up front in front of elementary, and they know inside of them, they're like, oh, I probably shouldn't be the person that's up doing this all the time, but man, I'm really good at it. And they get lots of positive reinforcement from that. Well, that could be a part of what's holding the church back. The fact that they're not multiplying themselves out. and they're not finding other people who should really be up doing that, large group time in front of elementary. And so the thing I would be encouraging leaders, who are listening in today, I would say, what are you doing on your end to multiply yourself, multiply, the leaders around you, multiply what you're doing. So it's ultimately, you're constantly trying to work yourself out of a job, because to get over this barrier, it's going to require you to be thinking strategically and thinking above the horizon and what's coming next, and how do we, grow the thing overall, rather than just the individual pieces that I'm involved in leading today.
Generally speaking, I know the churches do this all kinds of different ways, but in your experience and with you, what is your preference in student ministry? Do you prefer to see it structures that the students are in the main services on Sunday, and then their environment happens some other time, during the night, at night, during the week or whatever? Or do you like seeing programs for them during the service, if they have space in the building?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're a smart guy, so you know that people do that, like you say, in a lot of different ways. Personally, I think for high school students particularly, I think I would default towards having high school students in the service for a couple of reasons. One, I think it can be a bridge to this kind of post-college thing. I really do buy the idea that we're trying to ultimately develop intergenerational relationships with young people. And so that's one way to do that. I also think it forces the adult programming to think about the fact that there's high school students in the room, which I think that has, Carrie Newhoff's been saying this for a few years, I think has all kinds of positive spin-off for them as they try to reach unchurched people. It goes both ways. And then I think it also, for high school students, I think it that then frees them up to be serving in middle school ministry, if that's happening on a Sunday morning, because they could kind of do an attend one, serve one, where they're sitting in the service and then also serving the generation coming up behind them, which I think is really positive. I think there's something to that. I think the idea of college and university students serving high school students who serve, middle school students who serve elementary students, I think there's something to that. And that's obviously not hard and fast, but I think there's something in there that's positive. The churches I've worked in have had the enviable spot of our adult programming, does engage students, and it is a place where, partly because they're led by Tim Lucas, the guy who's the lead guy at Liquid, he was an English high school teacher, and so he really kind of sees the world through that lens, and so it's very good at communicating that way. Bruxy Cavey at the Meeting House, he similar communicator, really is almost like a college professor, kind of a little bit of the nutty professor thing, and so he's a similar way, was very good at engaging a younger audience. So that's been a bit of my bias just because of the environments I've been in. So that could be what's shadowing that.
Yeah, that's my bias too. We have high schoolers in the service. We actually even have middle schoolers in the service. And I've seen plenty of churches where they have middle school environment separate, and I think that's okay too. But some version of that, I like seeing high school students in the service before they graduate, because I do think it makes a difference with them sticking. Our pastor had to reference high school students on Sunday because part of his message was speaking about the relationship with parents. It was just a small little thing. It wasn't even the main part of the message, but it was a reminder that he knows they're there, because he addressed them specifically. And if he hadn't, it would have been weird. It's like, they're here and you just talked about that and you didn't even mention them. So you got people listening are thinking, well, I would love to have worked for Rich because he values family ministry. But so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your experience working with family ministry staff. What would you say to children's ministry leaders, student ministry leaders, from your experience working with them, leading as an executive pastor?
Well, so a couple of things. First of all, part of leading up in any organization is understanding what it is that your leader values. So by definition, an executive pastor, a lead pastor, they've got a lot of plates that they're spinning. They're trying to figure out, the whole thing. And, there's a lot of moving parts, and, our stuff always feels like the most strategically important piece of the puzzle. Whatever we're working on feels like, man, this is the whole thing turns on this. And although I think for a large case in a lot of churches, that's true with family ministry. It's like we need to make sure we're investing there and doing a good job there. That, a lot of times you just have to acknowledge in your mindset that your executive pastor or lead pastor they have a lot of other things that they're wrestling about. And so a part of and I've given this advice to a lot of pastors over the years, or a lot of leaders, young leaders, I said, what you need to do is listen very carefully for what the priorities of your leaders are. Like listen. And it'll come out in explicit ways, but it actually comes out in a lot of implicit communication in, what they pray about when they're together, with leaders. What are they worried about? What makes them, it's the Bill Hybels thing. What makes you cry? Like, what is the thing that you're emotionally connected to? And I think you need to, as you interact with them, first you need to understand what kind of turns their crank, what they're interested in, what they're focused on, and then second, you need to think about how does family ministry interact with that. So, if you're, I'll give you a perfect example. So at Liquid Church, we were, they still are, really interested in the clean water cause, and so kind of their international outreach efforts are focused around providing clean water to some of the poorest places in the world. And I remember I once had a youth, staff member come to me, and they were like really fired up about this other, and we did a lot around clean water. Like we gave a Sunday every year to it. We sent trips. We gave away literally millions of dollars, probably close to $3 million, all over the world. It was a major rallying cry for the church. So there was no ambiguity that this was an important deal for us. I had a student pastor, minister person come and say like, that's fine about that. All this water stuff is great, but I really think we should be, involved in sex trafficking, and not actually doing sex trafficking, but fighting sex trafficking. And and they expressed some passion around that. Now, that's fine. Like I'm not saying, hey, your church shouldn't be involved in, in fighting this sex slavery. But it was a fascinating moment to me because I felt like the leader, it was like they were missing the passion of our church. It was like they hadn't been paying attention. And so unfortunately what happens, and maybe it shouldn't happen this way, but unfortunately in my head, there's like a weird box that gets checked, which is like, I don't actually see that as a leader who's like super fired up for what's happening here. I actually see them as like, oh, they maybe, are interested in things in other places and not really super committed to what's going on here. And particularly in an area where, instead of aligning with kind of what are we doing, where are we fired up, what's happening here, I've seen this in this same passion work itself out around multi-site. A lot of times churches in this kind of 700 to 1,000 range, pretty typically a church of 700 to 1,000 range, they're all thinking in one way or another about going multi-site. If they're not multi-site now, they're thinking about it. And you'll run into, like, the church will start talking about that. And then you'll have a leader who will be like, yeah, I'm just not sure about this multi-site thing. Like, I'm not sure that it's worthwhile from a kid's point of view. And like, maybe we won't do all the programming in the new location. And what that does is it undercuts your leadership with the broader leadership group, with your executive pastor and lead pastor, as opposed to saying, even if you have those reservations, as opposed to saying, you know what, I really want to understand the implications of this. Can you help me reach out to, again, maybe it's the same thing I said before, help reach out to 4 or 5 other churches who are just a little bit farther down our road. There may be 2,000 people, and I would love to interact with their kids people to really understand how have they replicated and what does that look like and how can we do that best and what can we learn, what did they do, what did they wish they didn't do, and all those kinds of things. Well, what happens is a leader who does that, who proactively says, I see that you're interested in multi-site, and I want to get there, and I want to learn, that ultimately garners them more influence rather than less. They're the kind of people that then the senior leaders look at and say like, oh, that's an important this is an important person. I'm glad that they're on our team. The final piece of it, which is just a leadership advice in general, that's not specifically family ministry to kind of executive pastor, but. And I think it's Andy Stanley who said this. You might refer to him as the Pope. Said, public loyalty or public affirmation buys private loyalty. So if you speak highly of your leaders with your leaders, your leaders will with the people that you lead. your leaders, the people who lead you, will notice that. If they see you, backing what they're doing, positively reinforcing, like, hey, we're so excited about this that's happening in our church. And it doesn't need to be like sycophant, like, oh my goodness, Pastor Fred is amazing. Like, it doesn't need to be that. But I do think there are times where your executive pastor, if they're totally honest, they look into the family ministry realm and they're like, are those people with us? Like, or are they just doing their own thing? Like, I don't know if they ever attend the adult services. I don't know if they are, they're so busy. I don't know if they're even in a small group. Are they connected to this ministry, or are they really just running their own thing? Are we just funding their ministry, or are we all doing this together? And so going out of your way to find, ways to reinforce in a positive manner, hey, like, good things are happening at the church in general. I just love this. And I love what's happening here. That ultimately will help those leaders ultimately draw you in more to a closer, leadership relationship.
I would imagine too, and I don't know if this is something you experienced, that you could think of in the past, but being able to help leadership with the things they care about. Yep. Obviously, it's kind of the same thing. Buys you some more influence or whatever when you need help with the thing you care about. So I don't know what that might be. Even the clean water thing could be a good example. So the opposite might be if that person had come and said, hey, we really want to help with this and make this a bigger, awareness with the student ministry. What if we did a special thing at one of our student gatherings? I mean, like, totally unasked. Nobody said, hey, do this. And they volunteer that. That's could have the opposite effect of like, okay, I'm helping with the things you care about because I do care about the whole church. So I imagine that's something that we could all do more of, I'm guessing. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And a part of that is looking for those opportunities, is listening and trying to say, like, hey, how do we make this thing better? How do we apply our, creative resources? And again, this is not just me trying to pander to your audience. Like, I literally think the most creative people are in kids ministry and in student ministry. Like, you guys do all kinds of really creative things. And if you, could apply some of that energy to, projects that have a church-wide impact, rather than just kind of always playing the woe is me. We always get the bum rap. We always get the least funding and blah, 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 all that stuff. And saying, no, like, we're so glad to be a part of this, and we're happy to help. And yeah, we're going to do this thing to help push this thing forward. I think would be huge, would be well received by your leaders for sure.
So as we wrap up, is there anything, last bits of advice you'd give about leading up or working with the executive pastor, or just breaking that 1,000 barrier, in your church as a family ministry?
Yeah, the one other thing, which is probably super practical thing, which I say the same thing to creatives, like leadership, spreadsheets are the language of leadership. And so a lot of times people who operate in, more creative aspects of our ministry, it's like they cringe when it comes to anything to do with spreadsheets. So like they can't do that. They're like fussing about their expense reports, or they're like, why do we have a budget anyways? I just want to, reach people for Jesus, or, like that kind of thing. But, the executive pastors, typically that's the realm they lead in, right? They speak spreadsheet, right? They speak Excel. And so you can't ignore that. You can't just be like, oh, I guess so, whatever. Like you've got to package up what you're saying to them in that language that they, can see. So that would be that's maybe one last thing. And that also, I think, even for leaders, as you kind of transition into being a leader of a system, or ultimately a leader who leads leaders, people who lead at a high level, a lot of what you're doing is managing data. You're managing, trying to kind of understand what's happening from, a wide variety of inputs, and that ultimately drives back to some numbers. And so you've got to get your head around that stuff. And it's very learnable. It's not, it's not like, oh, don't be scared of that stuff. You can do that for sure.
Great. Well, how can people connect with you? I know you're doing a little bit more work with churches, helping them break the 1,000 barrier, which I think is a great thing. Even though it's like we talked about, a small percentage of churches, I think it is a barrier that a lot of churches could use help with. Overall, it's not a large number, but when you get around churches that are 700, 800, 900, whatever, there's a reason only 2% get past that.
Totally.
And I don't think it's just because it's just how it plays out in terms of size or averages or whatever. I just think it's kind of like that 200 barrier or whatever. It's just a really tough one to crack. So how can people connect with you just to learn more if they have any questions, or maybe they're in that space right now and could use some help?
Yeah. So the best thing you can do is drop my blog. It's unseminary.com. So, and we blog. I have a regular podcast and, blog posts around, a whole bunch of wide variety of issues, but all my stuff's there. They could subscribe to my, podcast or to my, there's a bunch of girls outside screaming outside my window here because I think they're having fun. I'm not sure why.
Well, you are at a camp. You are at a camp, so something.
I know. I'm at a camp this week, so that's why. But that's how you can do it. Drop by unseminary.com. That's the best place.
Cool. And I listen to the unSeminary podcast all the time. I didn't tell you about this before we recorded, but I've listened to certain podcasts of yours and then followed up with like your guest to like learn more. And I'm sure, people do that all the time. The one that comes to mind is Greg Curtis. And
fantastic.
Some of the stuff
Greg's
he talked about.
The simulation stuff is incredible.
It is. And I just find there's, it's hard to learn from other churches exactly how they're doing assimilation well, because a lot of churches don't track it. So the whole spreadsheet thing you mentioned, like they don't know how to tell you what they're doing. They might be doing a great job, but just not in any way they can measure or translate or whatever. So I encourage everybody to listen to the Seminary Podcast. I love also the resources like you put together. I think of like the first time guest gift thing, like there's just all those examples of first time gifts that churches give to guests. I love that. The generosity stuff most recently that I saw. So definitely visit there. People can connect with you. And I think, like me, they should listen to the podcast. It's great. So thanks for doing that.
Thanks, Nick. And like I said, I love family ministry people. I love what you're doing. This is a great podcast. What a great resource to people. And thank you so much for having me on.
You bet. Thanks, Rich.
Take care.
I bet that if you've ever built a building or been part of that process in your church, you wish Rich was your executive pastor, because he has a great perspective on what's needed for kid space, student space, all that stuff, which is great. Here are a couple action items I had coming out of that interview. One, I think you can identify which of the barriers Rich talked about applies to your church right now. Again, regardless of size. Maybe you're nowhere near this size. Maybe you're much smaller, your church is much larger, whatever it might be. You probably are facing a barrier related to one of these things that Rich talked about. So identify which one applies to your church the most right now. And then another action item, of course, is to do something about it, to meet, gather some people together and talk about how can you strategically overcome that barrier. In fact, for some of you that are in really large churches, you could be seeing this barrier in a different way. You could be seeing it within your ministry by itself. And I know most of us listening, you're thinking, yeah, we definitely do not have 1,000 kids or 1,000 students in our church, but some people do. And the same barriers apply even within a ministry, because there can be limits there that are keeping the ministry from growing. So I would figure out which barrier applies to you the most and then start meeting to really come up with a plan of how you're going to attack that, remove that barrier, and get that out of the way so your church and your ministry can grow. You can get all the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 68. In the next episode, I interview Clay Scroggins, and we talk about his new book, How to Lead When You're Not in Charge. You've probably heard about it. It's been getting a lot of buzz. He's done a number of different podcast interviews, had that great online free kind of webinar thing, which was awesome. Our staff attended that, and it was a lot of fun. So I had Clay on, and we talked about how to lead when you're not in charge, specifically from a family ministry perspective. So children's pastors, student pastors, next-gen pastors. We talk about what it looks like there, because Clay had been in student ministry, so he knows what it's like to be on both sides, so to speak, because now he's a campus pastor, and he could be viewed as the guy who's in charge, even though he's not ultimately. So it's a great book. I mentioned in that interview that the thing I loved about the book the most is just how practical it is, because it takes this thing that can be very theory-based and gives you actual steps and things you can do to use your influence, even when you're not in charge, which is pretty much all of us, right? So you don't want to miss that. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And like when the one comes out with Clay, you get a notification and you're ready to listen to it right there. Before I sign off, one last reminder, if you want to join a mastermind group or the volunteer playbook group, be sure to do that soon, as those groups are filling up. and it looks like we certainly won't make it to the September 15th deadline. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and hopefully I can help you with those. But we'd love to have you in a group. They're a lot of fun. We really do learn from each other in a big way. It's been the best thing I've ever done, being a participant in a mastermind group, and then even leading them. Again, you just learn from everybody in the group. It's really, really powerful. So if you want to join the Volunteer Playbook group, help recruit more volunteers, that's a new thing that I'm piloting. But I'm really excited about that because really the same reasons. It's going to be a bunch of us coming together. We're going to learn, and I'm going to teach more content in that one. But what I'm looking forward to is everybody in the group sharing what they're doing so that collectively we can get better at recruiting, training, and retaining volunteers. So sign up for that if you're interested. Until then, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.